so we should start recording very soon. Good evening and welcome all to this final event in the 2021 programme of the Centre for Research and Enterprise in Language, that's CREL Narratives Seminar Series, which I co-organise alongside Justine Bailey and Emily Critchley with the support of Maria Arke, who's the director of CREL. For those of you, which I think is probably no one, but anyway, for those who don't know me, my name is Katerina Stenka. I'm a lecturer in English literature here at Greenwich, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this fantastic panel, which, as Maria just told us, features one of our own, Dr. Jennifer Young from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as an erstwhile kind of colleague, I guess, Ian Heames, a poet, editor and founder of Face Press. So I'll be introducing the speakers individually in due course. Jennifer is going to speak first, followed by Ian, after which there will be time for audience questions. However, before we get started, I'd just like to say something brief about the rationale for bringing these two speakers together and to argue that their combined insights have exciting and widely applicable relevance to research practices in a range of fields, well beyond traditional literary studies. This is an interdisciplinary seminar series, so that's something we want to put emphasis on. These speakers also, I think, invite us to imagine and construct new narratives for talking about creative writing, about editing and publishing, and about wider practices of language use, as well as the connection between these quite different activities. Another of the many great things about tonight's talk is, to speak in kind of historical materialist terms, that both of them, I expect from the abstracts, will draw our attention to the material conditions for the production of literature. Their talks will take in a wide span in the history of print, from early editions of Shakespeare in the 17th century to the phenomenon of DIY poetry publishing in the late 20th century. Yet, despite the difference in historical and indeed no doubt methodological focus, both speakers will be inviting us to attend to aspects of culture that are too often still disregarded, namely the practical, economic, material, logistical and technological dimensions of even such supposedly rarefied artistic products as now canonical play texts and avant-garde or experimental or niche poetry. For Young, turning our attention from a canonical author, the canonical author Shakespeare, to the agents responsible for producing the material object, the books, that allowed his creations to circulate, gives us access to new insights and perspectives regarding the creation of literary texts and their meanings. Ian will also focus on the material production of literature, but he'll be taking us a few centuries on to the late 20th century to describe some aspects of the so-called mimeo revolution, in which, as I understand it, what we'd call photocopying opened up new ways for individual writers to produce and circulate their work. As Ian will suggest in the final section of his talk, this historical narrative has relevance to present-day poets seeking to reach an audience for their work. So hopefully it's clear already that these talks connect at many levels, and I'm looking forward, after they've spoken, to considering those connections during question time with you guys. But now for the talks themselves. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Young, who's also a colleague that I teach with an awful lot, so it's lovely to have you here. Jennifer is a senior lecturer in early modern English literature at the University of Greenwich. She is co-author of Shakespeare in London, Art and Shakespeare 2015, and has published articles and chapters in a range of research venues. Her research focuses on the printers and publishers of Shakespeare's earliest editions, and she is currently working on a monograph exploring the relationship between early modern members of the book trade and Shakespeare. This summer, an article inspired by the research in today's paper will appear in the Journal of Early Modern Literary Culture. Her paper today is entitled Shakespeare for the Triers, Richard Hawkins and the Q2 Othello at the Sergeant's Inn. Over to you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks, Katerina. I'm going to just try to rend control from you so I can share my screen.
Is it working?
Did you just make me this is, okay, hold on, it's coming. It's the first time I've done this not teaching, so it feels a little bit awkward. All right, hopefully my screen. All right, we'll get going then. All right, first of all, thanks to Katerina for inviting me to come and speak, and to the other members of CREL for inviting me and organizing this session. So I'm going to start with a little opening anecdote. In 1630, a modest-sized bookshop at the end of a row of shops on Chancery Lane began selling this playbook. Come on. Not sure why that. There we go. Her special effects. It was not a new play. Customers venturing into the shop might have seen William Shakespeare's tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, in performance beginning back in 1604 and as recently as 1629 at the Blackfriars Theatre, or they might have read it in quarto in 1622 or in the folio in 1623. By 1630, play quartos were commonly marketed with title page woodcuts depicting a memorable scene, or with language highlighting a second or third edition as new. This title page, with its small printer's device and swaths of white space, looks a bit old-fashioned in comparison. In fact, it is a near replica of the earlier edition. And you can see that the detail goes to the level of the ligatures of the O and the E in the word tragedy. And if you scroll down a little bit further, you can see there's a dash between Blackfriars, and it's not even just a straight one, it's a little slanted one. So there's a real intention suggested here to reproduce the older version. It is a cliche to suggest that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but in the case of this particular book, it is especially true. Behind what textual scholars regard as a rather typical Shakespearean title page is a rather unusual text. The 1630 edition of Othello, hereafter referred to as Q2, does not follow the editorial tradition in which subsequent quarto and folio editions developed in separate parallel tracks that preserved the historical differences between the two. By this logic, the Q2 should largely be a copy of the Q1, with perhaps some incidental variants of house style or inadvertent errors introduced in typesetting. In reality, Q2 is a 5-act conflation of the 1622 Q1 and the 1623 folio editions of Othello, making it unlike any previous version of Othello and unique amongst printed Shakespeare to that date. It is also a record of dozens of choices made by a textual agent between Q and F, and this point will become more important as the paper goes on. As someone interested in the relationship between early modern stationers, that's members of the Professional Guild of Printers, Publishers, and Booksellers, and their connections to Shakespeare's plays in print, the Q2 has been a continued source of fascination for me. Charlton Hinman's study of the making of Q2 revealed a process of numerous comparisons and decisions between Q and F texts. And according to Hinman, these choices were then recorded either by being copied into the margins of the Q1 or, in cases of longer inserts, transcribed onto separate slips of paper that were then inserted into the copy text quarto before it was brought to the printer. This was a time-consuming process of close reading and transmission that in modern contexts could only be described as editing, but it is usually the typical line in early modern textual studies to resist using that word for the kind of work that these textual agents do. So my question has always been, why would an early modern stationer publish such a time-consuming and kind of strange edition? In my upcoming monograph, I examine the agency behind the textual makeup of Q2, and I argue for its publisher, Richard Hawkins, as a possible candidate for editor of the conflation. But today I wish to focus on the relationship between texts and the Inns of Court, to consider this why question in terms of Q2's place in the culture and geography of Hawkins's bookshop. In Renaissance drama and the politics of publication, Zachary Lesser demonstrated that play texts were chosen and constructed by publishers to appeal to a particular niche market of local clientele. It stands to reason that Hawkins's decision to publish the Q2 similarly was informed by his knowledge of his current and anticipated customers. In short, it doesn't make sense to offer a text that has no chance of appealing to its local readership. I'm not going to suggest that I can definitively determine Hawkins's thinking behind Q2, but by contextualizing this play in the social and historical details of the people, places, and ideas of where it was first sold, this paper will situate Q2, a play that is an outlier in narratives of Shakespeare in print, within a narrative of textual transmission in this area of the Inns of Court, offering further insights into the influences that may have shaped this fascinating example of early modern textual transmission. So I'm going to begin with a little bit about Richard Hawkins and his shop. The earliest surviving imprint bearing the name of the stationer Richard Hawkins is the first edition of Elizabeth Cary's play, The Tragedy of Miriam, published in 1613. It describes his shop as, quote, in Chancery Lane, near unto the Sergeant's Inn. Imprints of all subsequent publications over the next 22 years of Hawkins's career as a publisher, bookseller, and bookbinder until his death in 1635 connect Hawkins's shop to Chancery Lane and the environs of the Sergeant's Inn. As you can see from the map, Hawkins' description of being near offers a range of possibilities for the location of his shop. However, an account book held in the National Archives belonging to the Sergeant's Inn that records rents collected from their tenants from 1621 to 1658. And I apologize, this is secretary hand, so you can see what I deal with sometimes. But this actually precisely connects Richard Hawkins' bookbinder, which you can see at the bottom of both of these images, to they connect him to with the last shop in a string of properties that's north of the Sergeant's Inn gate and, quote, adjoining the rolls. In addition to helping to pinpoint the precise location of Hawkins's shop, the accounts of rent collected reveal the first connection between Hawkins and the sergeants. He was not only near to them, he was known by name and profession to at least the sergeants who took turns collecting the rents over the years. Which makes this the perfect point to introduce Hawkins as landlords, the men of the Sergeant's Inn. In studying early modern drama and connections to the Inns of Court more generally, this is usually a notable way to show connections to the kind of general connection of the law court. The sergeants, as I'm going to just explain really quickly, are a little bit different, and so it's worth understanding. So we can see the connection between the narratives of readership and editing that follows. So this is just a little bit of historical context. The Sergeant's Inn, also known as the Order of the Coif for the white linen caps that was part of their formal dress, was a society of the most senior level of law practitioners. Members were chosen from the highest ranks of master of the bench and barristers from other inns, and they were appointed by the Crown on the advice of the Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas. These members had unique rights to petition the Court of Common Pleas, and it was from this group that the common law judges for the rest of the country were chosen. As a result of its unique function as a kind of senior inn, the population of the sergeants was markedly different from other inns. Consisting of only the most senior members, it was generally an older cohort, and because they all migrated from other inns as fully formed lawyers, there are no students in this inn. So we can imagine it lacking much of the youthful energy and chaos that comes with the student population, as well as the typical schedules of moots and lectures, and very important for our purposes, dramatic performances that took place at the other inns. The records of early modern drama actually do not list any performances at the Sergeant's Inn. So the usual connection that people who study Shakespeare and early modern drama would make between the inns and the theater does not apply. Comprised of senior and professionals, it is also a wealthier membership. As the bios of some identified sergeants suggest, they were often already wealthy and connected men. It was also expensive to become a sergeant, and it required, among other things, hosting a very elaborate feast where you were required to invite everyone. But it was also potentially quite lucrative, as judges would then go on to travel the circuit around the country and be paid for their labors. The list of other businesses run by Hawkins's neighbors around the Sergeant's Inn gate supports this profile of a higher class of men of the kind described above, living in proximity. In addition to Hawkins, as a girdler, so someone who makes girdles or belts, a sempster, who's someone who sews or is a tailor, a spurrier, who makes spurs, a chandler, who does candles, a haberdasher, and a ribbon seller. It is, in short, a row of shops not aimed at providing essentials, but accessories, particular indicators of status. It is a row of shops for gentlemen and gentry. And I just wanted to point out too, in the little extract at the bottom, that last image is something we don't get to see very often, but you can see it says under the ribbon seller line, it says, "Of Widow Hawkins, bookbinder." This is a reference to Richard Hawkins's wife after he's died, and it's a very rare mention in an official document of a woman functioning in a job as a stationer. So I always feel obligated to put that there because it's super cool. So, so we have the sense of these gentry living, these shops and this selection of members of this inn. But would these men stop at Hawkins's shop? Textual evidence from Hawkins's publications suggests it was a place patronized by members of the inn. In 1623, Hawkins publishes John Penckman's A Handful of Honesty, or Cato in English, which is dedicated first to, quote, "the judges and patrons of law and equity." Penckman repeatedly dedicates publications to very specific groups located near the point of sale. And this pattern, combined with his also residing at the Rolls, suggests Penckman was familiar with the area and recognized Hawkins's shop as a place that the judges might frequent. Hawkins's own paratexts, so that's anything that's in the text that is not the body of like the fictive work. Hawkins's own paratexts recognize and seek a connection to this readership. In his 1628 publication of Philister, another play quarto, he directs the dedication to, quote, "the understanding gentry," rather than just to generic readers. In the same dedication, he refers to his readers as triers. This term could mean a critical reader, as noted by Adrian Johns in Nature of the Book, but in the 16th and 17th century, it could also refer to those who pass judgment in a more official capacity. And I argue elsewhere that this kind of wordplay is actually characteristic of Hawkins's writing ability, as we shall see in a moment. Recognizing Hawkins's clientele as part of an upper class of judges and inn's members resonates with Wilfred Prest's observation that in the 17th century, as the 17th century progressed and the legal profession expanded, there becomes a split in practitioners of the law between higher branch barristers, so upper barristers, masters of the bench, and sergeants, and the more practical lower branch of solicitors and attorneys. Identifying this group as a niche market for Hawkins is a key point of connection between the inns, Hawkins's repertoire, and the Q2 Othello. Wilfred Prest, and more recently Jessica Winston's Lawyers at Play, studies literary members of the inns and connects engagement in a variety of literary pursuits as a way for someone in the higher branch to distinguish themselves among the masses of inns members. In particular, Winston highlights the translation of classical texts and poetic writing in forms such as Senecan drama, Ovidian epilia, lyric poetry, satirical epigrams, and neo-Spenserian pastorals. And these were all forms that these legal men used to distance themselves from their colleagues, to set themselves as literally like a kind of cut above. Aware that creative writing was an activity many of the higher branch members of the inn were engaging in, may be a reason why Hawkins began to include his own poems in the marketing of his publications. So we can see here two examples of poems that Hawkins has included in plays written by other playwrights as part of his marketing of his Mataphilus, a play and no play, who this book shall read, will judge and weep as if 'twere done indeed. I'm going to focus on that one as kind of for the sake of time, but of course we can go back and look at the other one. Hawkins's prefatory poems consistently try to engage the reader, by responding to an anticipated or actual concern or question of a customer. Now, textual scholars see such paratexts first as a commercial strategy to engage their readers, but because Winston cites epigrams as a form preferred by literary men of the inns, Hawkins's poems become a more creative act of textual fashioning. He's not just speaking to his readers, he's using a form they might associate with the interactions of their own elite social group. Adrian Johns reminds us that, quote, the reading of a book could be substantially affected by the perceived conduct and above all the perceived character of the stationer that produced it. So by him using these kinds of elements, it's an expression of his character, and it also is a way to kind of give credit to his text. By presenting himself as the author of these poems through titles like The Stationer to the Dramatophilus, which is really just kind of a weird Latin-y thing for folks who like plays, and The Stationer's Censure, Hawkins presents himself not simply as a stationer, but one who has a similar appreciation for poetry and poetry writing. Moreover, Hawkins's choice to write poems relating to his profession, where he considers the effect of reading a play versus seeing a play, resonates with Winston's conclusion that members of the inns used such literary play to, quote, navigate their own changing status and that of their institutions at times when the size and role of the profession were in transition. For the most elite members of the inns in Hawkins's neighborhood, poetry and creative writing were a space to further discuss and examine their professional lives. Hawkins recognizes this practice and, including at least 3 such poems in his publications, develops it into a strategy to identify and then communicate with his clientele. So now I'm going to move on to the Quarto and Othello and a couple of things in there that connect to this interest in poetry. So these examples that we see here are part of a larger group of evidence connecting the status and literary interests of elite members of the inns, like we would see in the Sergeants, to the paratexts of Hawkins's repertoire. However, if we go back to the Q2 title page, there are no pithy epigrams, and the Quarto contains no dedications to understanding gentry or careful triers of any sort. What we do have is the collection of choices between the Quarto, the Q1, and the F1 texts that are the base texts that result in the Q2 that we have here. Within this data, there are variants that suggest an awareness of the class of readers interested in literature described above. The variants that follow are part of a larger set of collations of reprinted editions of 4 different plays published by Hawkins. So evidence for identifying these categories is based on patterns of textual variation in the Q2, but also across these other 3 texts. So this is a sliver of a much bigger pool of data. So for example, when both the Quarto text and the folio texts were both considered acceptable and logical, but the Q2 seems to often prefer a folio reading over a Quarto, there's a group of variants that emerge that reflect what appears to be a preference for what might be best described as a more imaginative or harder reading. In Latin, this is sometimes referred to as lectio difficilior. And you can see here just by comparing the Q1s, which are on the top, and the F1 Q2 choices that are on the bottom, we have plume is chose over the make, exquisite is chosen over expert, joint is chosen over brawl, and conceit is chosen over counsel. They're all acceptable, and they all make sense in the context, but there's just this little bit of flair to the choices that are made for the Q2. And this is significant because it would have actually taken less effort to retain the totally acceptable Q1 readings. Remember, we have to copy the F1 choices into the Q1 copy text. So this suggests intention and labor and time consuming. It also suggests reading and considering and making a kind of an aesthetic choice. So this preference may also be considered the motivation behind one of the most famous additions to the Q2, which occurs in a song that Desdemona sings in Act 4, Scene 3. This is unique, actually. There is no Q. The song doesn't appear in Q1. It only appears in F1. So again, this would have been an opportunity where logically the editor, the textual agent, would have copied singing with the song into their text. But they didn't even want to just copy the song without making any changes. They've gone for sighing, which is not in the folio. In this case, not satisfied with the folio's obvious singing and having no alternative from Q1, Q2 provides sighing, an alternative that is potentially more performative, and also anticipates the ballad as it would appear in print almost a century later in a text called Percy's Relics, which is published in 1765. The profile of textual intervention across Hawkins's repertoire, of which more generally on word choice and poetics, that also includes, among other things, an interest in creating changes that show parallel sentence structures, repairing meter, often to the point of hypermetricality. It has to be always perfect iambic pentameter, and cutting instances of repetitive expressions of emo. He doesn't like too many OOOs or lord, exclamations. He tends to cut a lot of that. This interest in a more refined, poetic sounding language resonates with a perception of difference noted by Alan Farmer, Zachary Lessner, and others between the Elizabethan and Jacobean plays and the Caroline plays that were on stage and in print at the time that the Q2 is published. The 17th century printer John Oakes, for example, suggests that earlier plays exceed current drama in matter and subject, but confesses that the later Caroline plays, quote, have better for language, and these are exquisite and refined times. We could argue that one of the motivations for Hawkins is trying to elevate the language of Q2 and his other playtexts, as well as his own ventures into poetry writing for his paratexts, might be connected to this trend or preference for exquisite writing, a trend that cannot be completely removed from the fact that certain members of the Inns were now using similarly refined acts of writing and translation as a designation of status. How accurate such assessments were in reality is beyond the scope of this paper, but the consistent participation in the idea by the groups considered here offers one potential context by which to integrate the Q2 into the social and cultural history of its publication. So to conclude, this whirlwind study of possible connections between Richard Hawkins's publication of Q2 Othello and the Sergeant's Inn on Chancery Lane offers potential answers to my question, why would anyone invest in publishing such a text in this area at this time? Initial research into the area and populations of the Sergeant's Inn suggests that, being sold amongst a series of shops that catered to the higher status gentlemen of the inns, and alongside translations like Penkman's Cato that sought to patronize the highest ranks of innsmen, Q2 does appear to be physically well placed to engage this population. Hawkins's paratextual attempts to engage such readers through addresses and poetry suggests a wider strategy that was aimed at the lofty literary ambitions of this same group. Finally, the text of the Q2 itself, part of a larger strategy of updating texts seen across Hawkins's dramatic publications, can be contextualized within a trend of attention to the supposedly more refined, exquisite poetry that was perceived as a strength of Caroline drama and poetry. Thus, like the Q2 Othello, the Sergeants were unique amongst their kind, but the web of associations presented here highlights a resonance of text and place and people that demonstrates how publication in this area of the Inns of Court may have helped shape the transmission of this text. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that fascinating talk. And yes, it was whirlwind to an extent, but it felt like you managed to set out some really complex ideas in very clear and engaging ways. And I'm fascinated by those kind of artistic decisions that are involved in what's apparently just a kind of let's make up a new edition of Shakespeare. So thank you for that. So I think we're already beginning to see the distinction between sort of creative writer as author and sort of editor publisher as the technician, breaking down in productive ways, hopefully for our discussion later. I'm now going to turn off the recording for Ian, Here we go.